Welcome back, and welcome to another week of project management. Last week, we discussed how to develop a project plan. We learned about diagramming a project network using the activity on nodes method, processing early, late, and slack activity times, and identifying the critical path. This week, we'll discuss the risk management process, identifying different types of risks and approaches for responding to project risks and opportunities. This week, we'll be discussing Chapter 7, Managing Risks. As a project manager, you can document and plan. Hopefully all will progress as planned, but frequently something comes along to throw a wrench in your plans. Learning how to manage these wrenches or risks is what will help make you successful. A risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on the project objectives. Some examples would be project team members coming down with the flu, product needs to be redesigned, or new regulations add activities and lengthen the project. Some risks are known at the start of the project, such as equipment breakdown or changes in technical requirements as more is known about the project. Others, however, are unknown up until the moment they occur. Risk management is a proactive attempt to identify and manage events and threats that may affect the project's success. It addresses what could go wrong, how to minimize the risk, what can be done before it occurs, and what to do when it does occur. So you have a risk event, followed by consequences, anticipation, and finally, contingency plans. As we said earlier, risk management is a proactive approach rather than reactive. It's a preventative process designed to ensure that surprises are reduced and negative consequences are minimized. It also prepares the project manager to take action when an advantage is possible. It gives the project manager better control over the future and improves chances of reaching project objectives on time, within budget, and meeting required technical performance. Project risks are unlimited. A few examples of external forces are inflation, market acceptance, exchange rates, and government regulations. These are forces which you have absolutely no control over, but could potentially change the outcome of your project. These types of external forces are sometimes referred to as threats. As a project manager, you should not be focusing on dealing with problems, but rather you should be focusing on how to prevent them from happening. By performing risk management, you help to prevent problems and help make many other problems less likely. Some types of risks you might encounter as a project manager are technology, people, organizational, requirements, and estimation risk. Let's take a look at some examples of these. The risks involving technology may seem obvious. They include software incompatibility or hardware or software crashes. I've heard from some of you who have encountered the technology risk piece even in this class. Microsoft Project was originally designed to run on Windows-based operating systems. Those using Macs can't run this, so the link I gave you for the 60-day free trial wouldn't work. The software was not compatible. Hopefully, we've developed some risk development plans to avert the situation in the future. People are also at risk. If you need to hire for a specialized position, you may have difficulty finding someone with the necessary skills. This could delay your schedule, increase your costs, or even kill the project. Or your staff might become sick at a critical time in the project, setting the project back. The organization itself could be a risk. If the organization is restructured, you might find a new manager is responsible for your project. This manager may not have the same priorities or buy-in to the project. This could kill the project as well. The requirements themselves are a risk to be considered. If a requirement needs to be changed, it could require a major design rework. Adding to that, the customer may fail to understand the impact of the requirement change. Thus, you now have to address the scope creep. We just talked about this one last week, estimation. It is possible that the size of the project is underestimated and turns out to be much larger than originally thought. Or the time to complete the project has been underestimated. Either way, the mistakes made during the estimation is a risk that will need to be identified and assessed. The risk management process helps us as project managers in planning for and dealing with risks that may arise. The first step is to identify the risk. You'll need to analyze your project and identify sources of risk. Step 2 is to assess the risk. When doing this, you want to look at the severity of the impact, the likelihood of it occurring, and its controllability. The third step is to develop a risk response. The risk response provides a strategy to reduce possible damage and a contingency plan. The last step is to control the risk response. Here, you'll implement your risk strategy and monitor and adjust the plan for new risks. This image provides a helpful visual of the risk management process. You can see that the process is not linear. As you move through the steps, it is possible new risks will be identified, and the process will need to start from the beginning. Let's take a closer look at each of these steps. Step 1 is risk identification. During the planning phase, the project managers work with the core team members and relevant stakeholders to brainstorm all the potential problems. A list is generated of all possible risks that could affect the project. This list first identifies the macro risks, then narrows down to specific events. One mistake that is frequently made at this point is focusing on the objectives instead of on the events that could produce consequences. Only by focusing on actual events can potential solutions be found. Organizations use the risk breakdown structure along with the work breakdown structure to help identify and eventually analyze risks. Here's a look at a generic risk breakdown structure. The focus at the beginning is on risks that can affect the whole project rather than a specific section of the project or network. After the macro risks have been identified, specific areas of the project can then be looked at more closely. As risks are identified, they are generally organized around specific project deliverables. Risk profiles, a list of questions that address areas of uncertainty in a project, are updated and refined during the post-project audit. Of all the risks identified in Step 1, the most significant risks should be assessed first. All risks are analyzed in terms of probability and impact. Scenario analysis is most commonly used for analyzing risk for probability and impact. Credible and quality risk analysis requires that different levels of risk probability and impact be defined. Impact should be assessed in terms of project priority. Risk ranking needs to be established immediately. Impact scales of risk, the image you see here, is an example of how impact scales can be defined for cost, time, scope, and quality. In addition to evaluating the severity and probability of risk events, the team may also be able to assess when the risk is likely to occur. As discussed on the previous slide, the team may also be able to assess when the risk is likely to occur. To do this, they would use a risk assessment form seen here. This form also shows the assessed detection difficulty. The risk severity matrix provides a basis for prioritizing which risks need to be addressed. The red zone risks are top priority. The yellow zone are moderate and are to be addressed next. The green zone are risks that should be put on a watch list. Failure Mode and Effects Analysis, or FEMA, is a Six Sigma process. When used, it adds an additional element to impact and probability, detection. It multiplies each of the three scores to arrive at a severity rating. The formula is impact times probability times detection equals the risk value. PERT and PERT simulation can be used to review activity and project risk. It assumes a statistical distribution range between optimist and pessimist. The focus here is more on the macro and less on individual activities. It provides a list of potential critical paths and respective probabilities of occurring. Once a risk is identified, the project team needs to decide how they will respond to the risk. There are 4 methods to choose from: mitigating, avoiding, transferring, or retaining risks. Reducing risk is usually the first alternative we try. There are 2 ways to do this: reduce the likelihood that the event will occur, and/or reduce the impact that the adverse event will have on the project. Testing and prototyping are frequently used to prevent problems from surfacing later in a project. By testing smaller sections before putting them all together, you can identify problems before they become large. Software companies will often do this. They will run tests on small, incremental pieces before checking them into the larger system. If the smaller piece has problems, it's easier to isolate and resolve it there. An alternative mitigation strategy is to reduce the impact of the risk if it does occur. Sticking with the software example, developers will often implement code as a redundancy in case a portion of the code does fail. If the original piece of code becomes a problem, the redundancy code kicks in to cover for the original piece, providing a seamless experience for the user. Thus, the impact of the risk of code failing is significantly reduced. Other mitigating risk strategies include investing in upfront safety training, choosing high-quality materials and equipment, and scheduling outdoor work during the summer months. Risk avoidance is changing the project plan to eliminate the risk or condition. It is impossible to eliminate all risk, but some risks may be avoided before you launch the project. For example, using proven technology and strategy. The project manager may decide to change how the project is to be completed in order to eliminate the threat entirely. Or they may decide to reduce the scope of the project to avoid certain risks. In areas of high uncertainty and risk, it is possible that the project will be shut down completely until other strategies are developed to respond to the possible risks. By transferring the risk, you are essentially passing the responsibility of the risk off to a third party. The risk is not eliminated, just managed by someone other than the performing organization. The most common example is fixed price contracts. By presenting a fixed price contract, the contractor assumes responsibility for meeting their obligation. Therefore, a monetary risk factor is added to the contract bid price. Another example is insurance. We pay a premium to another company to cover any unexpected outcomes that may result. Car insurance, health insurance, renter's insurance, etc. On large international contracts, host countries are insisting on contracts that enforce the build, own, operate, transfer provision. This states that the prime project organization will build, own, operate, then transfer the facility to be built until such a time as it has been proven successful. In this case, the host country transfers financial risk of ownership until the project has been completed. The transferring risk response is most effective when dealing with financial risk exposure. In some cases, risks are too large to be transferred. In those cases, organizations may choose to retain the risk. That means the organization has made a conscious decision to accept the risk should it occur. When this decision is made, creating a contingency plan is required. The more attention provided to risk response before the project begins, the better the chances of minimizing project surprises. Knowing that the response to a risk event will be retained, transferred, avoided, or mitigated greatly reduces stress and uncertainty. We mentioned the need for a contingency plan should an organization decide transferring the risk is not feasible. A contingency plan is an alternative plan that will be used if a possible foreseen risk event does occur. It represents actions that will reduce or mitigate the negative impact of the risk. While the risk response is part of the actual implementation plan and action is taken before the risk can materialize, a contingency plan only goes into effect after the risk is recognized. Conditions for triggering a contingency plan should be decided before the project begins, should be clearly documented, and widely communicated. When creating a contingency plan, be sure to include a cost estimate and identify where the funding will be coming from. Possible examples of sources of funding are workarounds, schedule buffers, or contingency funds which have been built into the budget. All parties should agree to the contingency plan and be given authority to make commitments. One person must be assigned to monitoring potential risks and for initiate the plan should it be necessary. This example of the risk response matrix provides you with the information which should be created with every project you manage. It provides the possible risks you identified, what response type you will use, the plan to address the risk, when to implement the contingency plan, and who is responsible. This is a clear way to communicate to the whole team and ensure everyone is on the same page. The contingency plan answers the what, where, when, and how much action will take place. Without a contingency plan, the project manager may postpone or delay the decision to implement a remedy. This can lead to panic and agreement to implement the first suggested fix, regardless of its merits. This could prove to be dangerous and costly. The contingency plan evaluates alternative fixes before the risk event occurs, allowing the project manager to select the best plan. Technical risks can often be the kind that cause a project to shut down. Contingency plans for technical risks take a look at what happens if the system or processes fail or do not work. I'm sure each of us can relate to this. We go into a situation, perhaps a school project, assuming we'll use one method. We try it, and it doesn't work, even though we were so sure it would. The first thing to do is identify the high-risk technical areas, then build models or design experiments to resolve the risk as quickly as possible. By isolating and testing the key technical questions early in the project, Project feasibility can be quickly determined and necessary adjustments made, such as reworking the process or, in some cases, closing down the project. Organizations will often ignore the threat of a project coming in behind schedule until it surfaces. One cause of schedule risk is the use of slack through the project. Once schedule risk is identified, the response is often to crash the project to get it back on track. This involves shortening one or more of the activities on the critical path and/or adding additional resources to the activity to complete it sooner. However, crashing increases the project costs due to funding the extra resources. Projects with a long duration need some type of contingency plan for price changes, which are usually upward. Avoid the trap of using one lump sum to cover price risks. An example of this is inflation. If inflation has been increasing by 3%, some managers add 3% for all the resources used in the project. However, this does not address exactly where price protection is needed and fails to provide for tracking and control. For those projects that are sensitive to cost, price risks should be evaluated item by item. If purchases and contracts change over the life of the project, they should be identified and estimates made of the magnitude of change. This ensures control of the contingency funds as the project is implemented. There are times when the funding for your project will get cut. This could occur any time from the start of your project to the end of your project or anywhere in between. This is sometimes due to organizational strategy changes, budget cuts, a market downturn, or a change in the political climate. Seasoned project managers recognize that a complete risk assessment must include an evaluation of funding supply. This is especially true for publicly funded projects. For most of this chapter, we have looked at the negative side of risk. However, there is a flip side, the positive side of risk. This is often referred to as opportunity. An opportunity is an event that can have a positive impact on project objectives. For instance, favorable weather can accelerate construction work. Essentially, the same process that is used to manage negative risks is applied to positive risks. Opportunities are identified, assessed in terms of likelihood and impact, responses determined, and even contingency plans and funds established to take advantage of the opportunity if they happen. The project management profession has identified 4 different types of response to an opportunity. First, exploit. This response seeks an opportunity to ensure that it definitely happens. An example would be changing a design to allow a component to be purchased rather than built internally. Second, share. This involves sharing the ownership of an opportunity with another party who is best able to capture the opportunity for the benefit of the project. An example of this would be a joint venture. Third, enhance. This is the opposite of mitigation. In this, action is taken to increase the probability of the opportunity happening. Examples include choosing materials that are likely to decline in price over time. And finally, accept. Accepting an opportunity is being willing to take advantage of it if it occurs, but not taking action to make it happen. Contingency funds are funds set aside to cover unidentified or unknown project risks. Project sponsors are often reluctant to set up contingency funds, as that would seem to imply that the project plan might be a poor one. The truth, however, is that risks are inherent to projects. One way to overcome this perception is to carefully document risk identification, assessment, contingency planning, and determine when and how funds will be distributed. With current high-technology projects, it is not unusual to see contingency funds running in the 20 to 60% range. Budget reserves are set up to cover identified risks and are allocated to specific deliverables or work packages. They are determined by costing out the accepted contingency plan. This should be communicated to the team. Doing so fosters trust and encouragement of good performance. If the risk does not happen, funds are removed from the budget reserve. This reserve decreases as the project progresses. Management reserves are set up after the budget reserves are identified and the funds are established. These reserves are established to cover unidentified and unforeseen risks. These are allocated to the total project. The management reserves are independent of budget reserves and are controlled by the project manager and the sponsor. They decide when a contingency plan will be implemented and when reserves are used. Time buffers are used by project managers to cushion against potential delays in the project. Like contingency funds, the amount of time buffered is dependent upon inherent uncertainty of the project. The more uncertain the project, the more time should be reserved for the schedule on critical activities, those that are part of the critical path. Buffers are added to activities with severe risks, merge activities that are prone to delays due to preceding activities being late, non-critical activities to reduce the likelihood that another critical path will emerge, and activities that require scarce and constrained resources. The use of time buffers requires the authorization of top management. Typically, the results of the first 3 steps of the risk management process are summarized in a formal document often called the Risk Register. It details all identified risks, their descriptions, category, probability, impact, response, contingency plans, owners, and current status. The Risk Register is the backbone for the last step in the risk management process, risk control. Risk control involves executing the response strategy, monitoring the triggering events, initiating contingency plans, and watching for new risks. Establishing a change management system to deal with events that require formal changes in the scope, budget, and/or schedule of the project is an essential element of risk control. Project managers need to monitor risks just like they track project progress. Risk assessment and updating needs to be part of every status meeting and should be documented on the risk register. It is up to the project manager to create a safe environment where team members feel comfortable raising concerns and admitting mistakes. Mistakes are acceptable. Hiding them is unacceptable. It is advisable to repeat the risk assessment exercise with fresh information. Review risk profiles and make sure relevant stakeholders are brought into the discussion. All risks are to be assigned to a resource who has full responsibility in responding to that risk. Project managers as well as team members need to be vigilant in monitoring risks at all times. Change management control is a major element of risk control. Changes come from many sources and easily fall into 3 categories. 1. Scope changes in the design or additions to the scope. A couple examples would be a customer request for a new feature or a redesign which will improve the product outcome. 2. Implementation of contingency plans represent changes in baseline costs and schedules and must be reported to change management. 3. Improvement changes suggested by the project team. Changes to a project are almost certain. A well-defined change review and change control process should be established early in the project. Change management systems are designed to accomplish the following. 1. Identify proposed changes. 2. List expected effects of proposed changes on schedule and budget. 3. Review, evaluate, and approve or disapprove of the changes formally. 4. Negotiate and resolve conflicts of change, condition, and cost. 5. Communicate changes to parties affected. 6. Assign responsibility for implementing change. 7. Adjust master schedule and budget. 8. Track all changes that are to be implemented. The project communications plan defines the decision-making process that will be used to evaluate and accept change. The diagram here provides a visual of the process used for change control. Assessing the impact of the change to the project is of particular importance. Sometimes the solution can have an adverse effect on other segments of the project. Change request forms are often used to describe the change being submitted. Here's an example of a change request and the type of information you will need to include if you need to fill one out. The benefits of using a change control system are: 1. Inconsequential changes are discouraged by the formal process. 2. Costs of changes are maintained in a log. 3. Integrity of the work breakdown structure and performance measures is maintained. 4. Allocation and use of budget and management reserve funds are tracked. 5. Responsibility for implementation is clarified. 6. Effect of changes is visible to all parties involved. 7. Implementation of change is monitored. 8. Scope changes will be quickly reflected in baseline and performance measures. We've covered quite a bit of content during this lecture. We've looked at the risk management process, including identifying risks, assessing risks, risk response, and risk control. We talked about the change management system and its importance and benefits as it relates to managing risk. In addition, we also discovered several ways to respond to risk, such as mitigating risk, avoiding risk, retaining risk, and transferring risk. Next week, we'll take a look at Chapter 8 and learn about scheduling resources and costs. Until then, I invite you all to the discussion board where we can all provide our thoughts and opinions on managing risks. Hope to see you there!